Move her somewhere less visible. The sentence wasn't loud, but in the glittering silence of the Langford Foundation ballroom, it landed harder than a slammed door. A few guests lowered their champagne glasses. Others pretended not to hear it at all. Naomi Carter kept playing the piano. Her fingers moved softly across the ivory keys beneath the warm gold light hanging from the 20-foot ceiling, calm and steady like the words hadn't reached her. But they had. Of course they had. Edward Langford stood near the center of the room in a charcoal tuxedo worth more than most people's monthly rent, one hand resting in his pocket, while donors and investors circled around him like satellites orbiting a cold planet. At 48, the billionaire real estate mogul carried himself with the polished confidence of a man who had spent years being obeyed without question. And tonight's gala was no different. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. Waiters in white jackets moved silently between tables dressed in black silk linen. Outside the towering glass windows, Manhattan glowed beneath a light November rain. Everything in the room reflected wealth, control, perfection. Everything except Naomi. She sat alone behind the grand piano in a simple dark navy dress with sleeves that covered her wrists and silver earrings small enough to almost disappear beneath her curls. She wasn't part of the guest list. She wasn't a donor. She wasn't important to people like Edward Langford. She was just the pianist hired to fill the silence between speeches. At least that's what he thought. "Sir, should I ask her to stop after this song?" the event coordinator whispered carefully beside him. Edward barely glanced toward the piano. "No, just move her after the set. Somewhere farther from the front." Naomi heard the words this time more clearly than before. The corners of her fingers stiffened for half a second against the keys, but she didn't stop. Years of working hospice care had taught her something important about pain. The sharpest kind was usually delivered quietly. Across the ballroom, guests resumed talking in low-polished voices about stock prices, Hampton's renovations, Aspen, vacations, and political fundraisers. Nobody noticed the way Naomi inhaled slowly before continuing the melody. Nobody except an elderly woman seated alone near the back table who watched her with soft understanding in tired blue eyes. The song drifting through the ballroom was gentle, almost fragile. It wrapped around the room like smoke, subtle enough to disappear beneath conversation unless someone truly listened. Edward didn't. He accepted another handshake, another congratulations, another promise from another investor. But then something changed. At first it was only a single note. One trembling chord buried beneath the music like a memory clawing its way to the surface. Edward froze mid-conversation. The blood drained slowly from his face. Across the ballroom, Naomi lowered her gaze toward the piano as her hands moved into a softer progression now, delicate and haunting. Edward turned fully toward her for the first time that night. The room blurred around him. The lights, the voices, the clinking glasses. All of it faded beneath the sound of that melody. Because he knew it. God help him, he knew it. 3 years earlier, on a rainy morning inside a private hospital room overlooking the Hudson River, his wife Evelyn had played that exact melody with trembling fingers while chemotherapy dripped into her arm. She had written the piece herself during the final months of her life. No recording existed. No sheet music had ever been published. After her funeral, Edward made sure of that. Yet somehow this woman, this stranger sitting behind the piano, was playing it perfectly. Every note, every pause, every breath between the chords. Edward's throat tightened painfully. Naomi finally lifted her eyes from the piano. And the second their eyes met across the ballroom, something inside Edward Langford cracked wide open. Edward Langford had not heard that melody in 3 years. Yet somehow every note still knew exactly where to cut him open. His fingers slowly loosened around the champagne glass in his hand as Naomi continued playing beneath the soft amber lights of the ballroom. Conversations around him faded into distant noise. The investors standing beside him exchanged uncertain glances, confused by the sudden shift in his expression. One moment, he had been discussing a $200 million waterfront acquisition in Miami. The next, he looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk through the front door. Naomi kept her eyes lowered toward the piano keys, but she could feel his stare from across the room now, heavy and unmoving. She had seen that look before in hospice rooms at 3 in the morning when families realized time was running out faster than they wanted to believe. Grief always had the same eyes, sharp at first, then hollow, The final notes drifted softly into silence. A few guests clapped politely, more out of social reflex than genuine attention. Naomi gave a small nod and began organizing the sheet music beside the piano. Her hands remained calm, even though she already sensed the room changing around her. Edward moved before he fully realized he was walking. The polished marble floor echoed beneath his shoes as conversations slowly died one by one nearby. Several guests stepped aside instinctively to let him pass. By the time he reached the piano, Naomi had already closed the music folder and stood quietly beside the bench. Up close, Edward noticed details he had ignored before. The faint tiredness beneath her eyes. The small silver cross resting against her collarbone. The careful stillness in the way she carried herself, like someone who spent most of her life trying not to disturb anyone. "Where did you hear that song?" His voice came out lower than he expected. Naomi looked at him directly now. Calm, respectful, unafraid. "A woman taught it to me a long time ago," she answered softly. Edward swallowed hard. "That song was written by my wife." Naomi's expression changed almost invisibly at the mention of Evelyn. Not shock, recognition. The ballroom lights reflected gently against the dark brown warmth of her eyes as she studied him for a brief moment that felt strangely personal. "I know," she said quietly. A cold silence settled between them. Behind Edward, several guests watched openly now, pretending to sip drinks while listening. The event coordinator stood frozen near the stage. Curtains, unsure whether to interrupt. Edward barely noticed any of them. His pulse had started climbing hard enough to feel in his throat. "That is not possible," he said. No one else knew that composition. Naomi lowered her hands slowly onto the closed piano lid. "Your wife played it for patients at St. Catherine Hospice during her treatments," she explained. "Sometimes she stayed after appointments just to sit with people who were scared to die alone." Edward blinked once, caught completely off guard. Evelyn had never told him that. In fact, during the final year of her illness, there were entire afternoons she claimed she wanted privacy, time alone, moments to think. He had believed her. Naomi continued carefully. "I worked there nights back then. I helped in the music therapy unit." Edward stared at her face now with growing disbelief, trying to connect this quiet woman standing in front of him with a hidden part of his wife's life he had somehow never seen. The realization unsettled him more than the music itself. "Evelyn never mentioned you," he admitted. Naomi gave the faintest smile, though sadness flickered behind it. "She mentioned you all the time." Something inside Edward tightened painfully at those words. Around them, the gala continued moving in slow polished circles beneath crystal chandeliers and soft jazz from the overhead speakers, but none of it felt real anymore. For the first time in years, Edward Langford was no longer standing inside a ballroom full of powerful people. He was standing inside a memory he did not fully understand. The silence between them stretched just a little too long for a ballroom filled with wealthy people who hated uncomfortable emotions. Somewhere near the back of the room, a glass clinked softly against silverware. Someone laughed too loudly at a joke that was not funny. But near the piano, nobody moved. Edward Langford stood frozen beside Naomi Carter, as if the entire gala had narrowed into that single moment beneath the chandelier light. "You worked with my wife for how long?" he finally asked. Naomi glanced down briefly before answering. "About 8 months." Edward frowned slightly. 8 months. The number hit him harder than expected. 8 months was not casual volunteer work. 8 months meant familiarity, routine, conversations, shared hours. Yet he had never once heard Evelyn mention Naomi's name. A strange pressure settled in his chest. Naomi noticed it immediately. "She probably did not want you worrying," she said gently. "Your wife spent a lot of time taking care of other people when she was sick. More than most families realized." Edward looked away for a second, jaw tightening. Across the ballroom windows, rain slid slowly down the glass in silver streaks against the Manhattan skyline. He remembered those months differently. Endless doctor appointments. Private specialists flown in from Boston and Zurich. Security teams. Schedules. Medications organized with military precision. He had spent millions trying to save Evelyn's life. Yet standing here now, he suddenly felt like a man who had somehow missed entire chapters of her existence. "She was exhausted most days," he said quietly, almost to himself. Naomi nodded once. "Sometimes, but not when she played." Her voice carried no judgment. Only honesty. Music made her feel like herself again. Edward stared at the closed piano lid beneath Naomi's fingertips. The polished black surface reflected distorted pieces of the chandelier above them like fractured stars floating in dark water. That melody, he said slowly. She wrote it during treatment. Naomi smiled faintly at that. Sadness softened her face in a way that made her look older for a moment. I know. She called it Winter Light. Edward's breath caught. No newspaper had ever published the title. No interviews mentioned it. Even at the funeral, the composition had remained private. His eyes narrowed slightly now, not with anger, but confusion deep enough to border on fear. How do you know that name? Naomi hesitated for the first time all evening. Not dramatic hesitation, just enough for Edward to notice. Because she played it for me the night she found out her treatments had stopped working. The words landed quietly between them, but Edward felt them like a weight dropped directly into his chest. Around them, the gala had slowly resumed. Movement again. Investors drifted back toward cocktails and polite conversations. A photographer crossed the ballroom near the auction tables. Somewhere in the distance, soft jazz returned through the overhead speakers. Yet Edward remained completely still. Naomi lowered her eyes again, voice softer now. She stayed late after visiting hours that night. Most of the lights in hospice had already been turned off. Edward could almost see it. Evelyn sitting beside a piano in one of those dim hospital common rooms she had never described to him. Her pale hands moving across the keys while strangers slept behind half-open doors. Naomi continued carefully. She told me something before she left. Edward looked at her sharply. What? Naomi met his gaze again, calm and steady despite the tension building inside him. She said you blamed yourself for not being able to fix things. Edward's face hardened instantly at the word fix. It was too accurate, too personal. You barely knew me, he said quietly. Naomi shook her head. No, but she did. The answer cut deeper than Edward expected. For several seconds he said nothing at all. His eyes drifted toward the rain outside again, while memories he had spent years locking away began surfacing one by one. Evelyn laughing barefoot in their kitchen at midnight. Evelyn sketching building designs beside him on long flights to California. Evelyn sitting silently beside a hospital window while snow fell over the Hudson River. He had spent 3 years convincing himself grief became smaller with time. Standing beside Naomi Carter now, he realized grief had only become quieter. Edward should have walked away. Every instinct built from decades inside boardrooms and negotiations told him to end the conversation, thank the pianist politely, and return to the carefully controlled version of himself the world expected. But something about Naomi Carter made that impossible. Maybe it was the calmness in her voice. Maybe it was the way she spoke about Evelyn without trying to impress him. Or maybe it was because for the first time in years, someone was describing his wife as a real person instead of a memorial portrait hanging in the lobby of one of his buildings. What else did she tell you? The question escaped before he could stop it. Naomi looked toward the ballroom windows where rain shimmered against the glass like liquid silver under the city lights. A lot of things, she admitted softly. Edward felt tension rise immediately in his chest. He had spent years protecting Evelyn's memory from public consumption. Reporters had tried turning her illness into headlines. Investors whispered about whether grief had weakened him. Even charity boards used her name to raise money beneath photographs that no longer felt personal. The idea that a stranger knew private pieces of Evelyn unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. You understand how strange this sounds, he said carefully. Naomi nodded. I do. Her honesty disarmed him again. Nearby, a waiter passed carrying a tray of champagne flutes, the soft crystal clinking quietly beneath the low hum of the gala. Naomi stepped away from the piano bench slowly, smoothing the sleeve of her navy dress with nervous fingers for the first time all evening. Your wife talked about music a lot, she continued. But mostly she talked about you. Edward looked down briefly, jaw tightening. I doubt that. Naomi studied him carefully then. She said you stopped sleeping after her diagnosis. The words hit too accurately. Edward felt his shoulders stiffen instinctively. She said every time she woke up during treatment, you were already sitting there pretending to answer work emails because you did not want her seeing you scared. A painful silence settled between them again. Naomi's voice remained soft, almost apologetic now. She loved you very much, Mr. Langford. Edward looked away immediately toward the crowd. A group of investors near the auction display had started laughing loudly over something insignificant. The sound felt distant, unreal. His reflection stared faintly back at him through the rain-covered windows. Expensive tuxedo. Perfect posture. Empty eyes. People love the version of me they see in magazines, he said quietly. That is different. Naomi shook her head once. No. She saw you when nobody else did. Edward exhaled slowly through his nose, fighting the pressure building beneath his ribs. He hated emotional conversations. Hated vulnerability. Hated the helplessness grief dragged behind it. Control was the only thing that had kept him functioning after Evelyn died. Work. Schedules. Acquisitions. Buildings rising from concrete and steel because buildings made sense. Buildings followed rules. Lost did not. Naomi glanced toward the piano again before speaking carefully. There is one more thing. Edward looked at her immediately. What? She hesitated. Not dramatic. Not manipulative. Just uncertain. The night before she passed away, your wife left something with me. Edward felt the entire room narrow around those words. What are you talking about? Naomi lowered her eyes briefly before reaching into the small leather bag resting beside the piano bench. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost protective. Edward's heartbeat began rising harder now, uneven beneath the calm expression he struggled to maintain. Around them, guests continued drifting through candlelight and polished marble floors, completely unaware that something inside Edward Langford's carefully constructed world was beginning to fracture apart. Naomi finally looked back up at him, her fingers resting gently against the edge of the bag. I never knew if I should give it to you, she whispered. Edward stared at her without blinking. Give me what? Naomi inhaled softly. Then she reached inside. Naomi's fingers disappeared into the leather bag slowly enough to make Edward's pulse climb with every passing second. Around them, the ballroom glowed beneath warm chandelier light, while rain whispered softly against the towering windows overlooking Manhattan. Somewhere near the auction stage, guests continued smiling for photographs, unaware that the most powerful man in the room suddenly looked like he could barely breathe. Naomi finally pulled out a small white envelope. Time had softened the edges slightly, and the paper carried faint creases like it had been unfolded and refolded many times over the years. Edward stared at it without moving. His throat tightened the moment he recognized the handwriting across the front. Evelyn. Even after 3 years, he would have known her handwriting anywhere. Elegant. Careful. Slightly slanted to the right. The sight of it hit him harder than he expected. Naomi held the envelope gently between both hands, almost reverently. She gave this to me 2 nights before she passed, Naomi said softly. She asked me not to deliver it unless you were ready to hear what was inside. Edward felt something sharp move through his chest. Ready? His voice lowered dangerously now, not angry exactly, but strained beneath the pressure building inside him. Why would she not give it to me herself? Naomi's eyes flickered downward for a brief second. Because she was afraid you would not listen back then. The words landed quietly, but Edward's jaw tightened immediately. Across the room, laughter drifted from a nearby table, strangely cruel against the silence surrounding them. Edward stared at the envelope in Naomi's hands like it might explode if he touched it. You kept this from me for 3 years. Naomi nodded once, honest and direct. Yes. Edward looked away sharply toward the windows, fighting the sudden surge of emotion threatening to crack through his carefully controlled exterior. Do you have any idea what I went through after she died? He asked quietly. Naomi did not defend herself. She simply stood there beneath the ballroom lights with calm sadness in her eyes. I think I do, she answered. I saw it happen to her too. That stopped him. Edward looked back at her slowly now, breathing heavier. Naomi continued carefully. Your wife talked about you constantly during those final weeks. Even when she was exhausted. Even when she could barely sit upright at the piano anymore. Edward swallowed hard. Naomi's voice softened further. But she worried about you. I was her husband, Edward replied immediately, almost defensively. I was there every day. Naomi nodded gently. Physically, yes. The answer cut deeper than Edward expected. He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. Because somewhere beneath the sting of those words, he knew exactly what she meant. During Evelyn's final months, he had become obsessed with solutions. Doctors, specialists, experimental treatments, numbers, contracts, flights. Meetings. He had spent so much energy trying to stop death that he forgot how to simply sit beside her in it. Naomi lowered her gaze toward the envelope again. Some nights she did not want another doctor, she said quietly. She just wanted someone to listen. Edward's chest tightened painfully now. He remembered nights when Evelyn asked him to stay home instead of flying to meetings. Nights he convinced himself work could not wait. Nights he kissed her forehead and promised he would make everything better somehow. Naomi slowly extended the envelope toward him. I almost mailed it dozens of times, she admitted. But every time I tried, I heard her voice telling me to wait until your heart softened again. Edward stared at the letter, but did not reach for it yet. His reflection trembled faintly in the nearby glass windows behind Naomi, distorted beneath rain and city lights. And what made you think tonight was the right time? He asked quietly. Naomi looked directly into his eyes now. No fear, no bitterness, just quiet truth. Because tonight was the first time you actually looked at another human being when they were speaking to you. The words landed harder than any public humiliation ever could have. Edward stood motionless beneath the chandelier glow as the silence between them deepened. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he reached for the envelope with trembling fingers. Edward held the envelope like it weighed more than the entire ballroom around him. The cream-colored paper trembled faintly between his fingers beneath the chandelier light, while rain continued sliding down the massive glass windows overlooking the city. For several seconds, he could not bring himself to open it. Naomi remained standing quietly beside the piano, giving him space without stepping away completely. Around them, the gala had shifted back into polished motion again. Wealthy donors drifted between candlelit tables. Waiters carried silver trays through the crowd. A jazz quartet somewhere near the balcony resumed, playing softly beneath the low hum of conversation. But for Edward, the room no longer felt connected to reality. Everything inside him had narrowed into the delicate curve of Evelyn's handwriting across that envelope. Slowly, he opened it. The paper inside crackled softly as he unfolded it with careful hands. Naomi looked away respectfully toward the rain-covered skyline, while Edward lowered his eyes to the page. The first line nearly stopped his breathing. If you are reading this, it means you finally slowed down long enough to feel something again. Edward swallowed hard. The ballroom noise faded instantly into distant static. He could hear Evelyn's voice in every word. Calm, warm, honest in the way she always was when nobody else was around. I know you are trying to survive this by controlling everything around you. Buildings, meetings, schedules, numbers. But grief does not listen to powerful men, Edward. It only waits quietly until they stop running. His fingers tightened around the paper. A pressure rose slowly into his throat as memories he had buried beneath years of work and silence began surfacing one after another. Evelyn laughing barefoot in their kitchen while old records played late at night. Evelyn curled beside him on the couch sketching designs on napkins while snow covered the windows. Evelyn squeezing his hand during treatment while pretending she was not terrified. Edward closed his eyes briefly. Naomi could see the change happening in him, now even without reading the letter. His posture had softened. The sharp billionaire certainty he carried like armor all evening was beginning to crack beneath something far more human. He kept reading. There is something I need you to understand. The people who helped me most at the end were not the famous doctors or investors who filled our mailbox with flowers. It was the quiet people, the nurses who stayed after shifts, the volunteers who sat beside strangers, Naomi, who played music when I could not sleep. Edward's eyes lifted instinctively toward Naomi for half a second before dropping back to the page. She stood beside the piano with her hands folded gently in front of her, calm beneath the warm glow of the ballroom lights. Not demanding recognition, not asking for anything, just waiting. The next line shattered him completely. You spend so much time looking above people that sometimes you forget to look at them. Edward's breath caught sharply. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the distant Manhattan skyline, while rain streaked silver against the glass. He remembered exactly how he had spoken about Naomi less than an hour ago. Move her somewhere less visible. Shame spread slowly through his chest now, heavier than any public humiliation he had ever experienced. He continued reading through blurred vision. If Naomi gives you this letter someday, be kind to her. She carries pain quietly the same way you do. She just learned how to turn hers into comfort for other people. Edward lowered the paper slowly. For several seconds, he could not speak at all. The sounds of the gala drifted around him in muffled waves while emotion pressed painfully behind his ribs. Naomi finally looked back toward him carefully. She wrote that during one of the quiet nights, Naomi said softly, after everybody else had gone home. Edward stared down at the letter in his hands. Then he looked at Naomi again, truly looked at her this time. The tiredness beneath her eyes. The dignity in the way she carried herself despite how easily people overlooked her. The calmness she held even after he dismissed her like she was invisible. His voice came out rougher than before. I treated you terribly tonight. Naomi gave the smallest shake of her head. No, she answered quietly. You treated me the way the world taught you to. Those words hurt even more because they were true. Edward Langford had spent years believing grief was something a person survived alone. That was how powerful men handled pain. Quietly, privately, efficiently. They buried themselves inside work until the sharp edges dulled enough to function again. But standing beside Naomi Carter beneath the chandelier glow of the ballroom, holding a letter written by his late wife with trembling hands, Edward realized something terrifying. He had not survived grief at all. He had simply built expensive walls around it. Outside the windows, rain continued falling over Manhattan in silver sheets, while the city lights blurred softly against the glass. Naomi remained beside the piano without speaking, giving him the kind of silence that did not feel empty. It felt safe. Edward lowered himself slowly onto the piano bench as though the weight inside his chest had suddenly become too heavy to carry standing up. The polished black piano reflected the ballroom lights across its surface like fractured pieces of water. He stared down at Evelyn's letter again, rereading the final lines silently. Be kind to her. She carries pain quietly the same way you do. Edward inhaled carefully, but emotion still tightened his throat. I thought I was protecting myself, he admitted quietly after a long silence. Naomi folded her hands gently in front of her. Most people who are hurting think that. Edward gave a hollow laugh beneath his breath. You say that like you know. Naomi's eyes lowered briefly toward the piano keys. I do. Edward looked at her fully now. Not as entertainment for the evening. Not as background noise at a gala. As a person. For the first time, he noticed how tired she looked beneath the soft ballroom lighting. Not physically exhausted exactly. More like someone who had spent years carrying invisible weight without asking anyone to help. Evelyn said you carried pain too, Edward said quietly. Naomi remained still for a moment before answering. My younger brother came home from Afghanistan 11 years ago, she said softly. He looked fine when people saw him outside. Smiling, standing straight. But inside, her voice faded gently. Edward listened without interrupting. Some nights he could not sleep unless I played piano for hours, Naomi continued. Other nights he sat beside windows until sunrise because silence made him panic. The rain tapping softly against the glass seemed louder now somehow. Naomi looked toward the city lights outside before continuing. Hospice work started because of him. I learned some pain does not need fixing first. Sometimes people only need someone willing to sit beside them while it hurts. Edward stared at her quietly. Those words reached somewhere deep inside him because they described exactly what he had failed to do for Evelyn at the end. He had spent so much time trying to rescue her from dying that he forgot how to simply stay with her while she was scared. Naomi glanced down at the piano keys, brushing one fingertip lightly across the smooth, ivory surface. A single soft note drifted into the air between them. Your wife understood that better than anyone I ever met, she whispered. Edward looked back at the letter in his hands. She told me once that music made people feel less alone, he said quietly. Naomi smiled faintly. That sounds like her. For several seconds, neither of them spoke again. The ballroom around them felt strangely distant now, like another world continuing far away beyond the warm circle of light surrounding the piano. Then Edward noticed something tucked carefully inside the folded letter. Another page. Smaller. He frowned slightly before sliding it free. Naomi's expression changed immediately when she saw it. Surprise flickered across her face. I never saw that part, she admitted softly. Edward unfolded the smaller paper carefully. His eyes scanned the first line, and his breathing stopped cold. If Naomi is standing beside you while you read this, it means she stayed longer in your life than she planned to. Edward slowly lifted his eyes toward Naomi again. Confusion mixed now with something deeper. Something almost impossible to name. Naomi looked genuinely unsettled for the first time all evening. "What does it say?" she asked quietly. Edward stared at her for a long moment before answering. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Evelyn wanted me to help you." Naomi stared at Edward in complete silence after hearing those words. The soft jazz drifting through the ballroom suddenly felt very far away, swallowed beneath the steady sound of rain against glass and the quiet pressure hanging between them. Edward looked back down at the smaller page in his hands, his heartbeat slow and heavy now beneath the perfectly tailored tuxedo that suddenly felt too tight around his chest. He continued reading carefully. "Naomi will never ask anyone for help. That is why she needs it more than most people." Edward frowned slightly as his eyes moved lower across Evelyn's handwriting. "Her brother is getting worse. She hides it well, but I can see the exhaustion in her face every night she comes to play music for the patients after working double shifts. If you ever meet her again someday, please do not treat her like the world usually does." Those final words landed painfully inside him because only an hour earlier, that was exactly what he had done. Edward slowly lowered the page. Naomi looked away toward the rain-covered windows, almost embarrassed now by whatever Evelyn had written about her. "She should not have said all that," Naomi murmured quietly. Edward studied her face carefully. "Why not?" Naomi crossed her arms lightly, not defensive exactly, just uncomfortable being seen too clearly. "Because people hear someone needs help and suddenly they stop seeing anything else about them." Edward understood immediately. Pity, charity, condescension disguised as kindness. He had seen wealthy people do it for years at events exactly like this one. They donated money to suffering without ever respecting the people carrying it. Naomi exhaled softly before continuing. "My brother Marcus came back from deployment different. Some days are good, some are not." Edward listened quietly. The Veterans Affairs waiting list is long. Therapy costs money. Medications cost money. She shrugged faintly, though the exhaustion behind the gesture was impossible to miss now. "So I work." Edward looked at her hands resting lightly against the piano. Strong hands. Tired hands. Hands that had probably spent years comforting strangers while carrying grief of their own. "And the hospice center?" he asked. Naomi smiled faintly at that. "It is the only place where people stop pretending life lasts forever." The honesty of that answer settled deeply inside him. Around them, the ballroom had begun slowly thinning as some guests drifted toward the exits beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Waiters quietly cleared empty glasses from linen-covered tables while city lights shimmered through the rain beyond the windows. Yet Edward barely noticed any of it anymore. His attention remained fixed entirely on Naomi Carter, the woman he dismissed without looking at earlier that evening. Now somehow felt more real than almost anyone else in the room. Edward folded Evelyn's letter carefully, smoothing the creases with trembling fingers before placing it back inside the envelope. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. Naomi looked at him gently. "You do not owe me anything." "That is not true." His voice carried more emotion now than she had heard from him all night. "I spoke about you like you were invisible." Naomi held his gaze calmly beneath the chandelier light. Most powerful people do that before they learn better. Edward lowered his eyes briefly, ashamed because he knew she was right. He had spent years entering rooms without noticing the people standing quietly at the edges of them. Staff members, drivers, servers, musicians, people whose lives existed outside his attention unless they became useful to him somehow. Naomi's voice softened slightly. "Your wife noticed everyone." Edward looked back at her immediately. "I think she was trying to teach me that," he admitted. Naomi smiled sadly. "I think she was trying very hard." For the first time that evening, Edward gave a small laugh beneath his breath. Not polished, not performative, real. The sound surprised both of them. Then his expression shifted again, thoughtful now. "Come with me tomorrow," he said suddenly. Naomi blinked softly. "Where?" Edward looked toward the rain-covered skyline outside the ballroom windows before answering. "There is a building downtown I was supposed to turn into another luxury hotel." He paused briefly. "I think Evelyn would hate that idea." Naomi studied him quietly, unsure where he was going with this. Edward looked back at her, and for the first time all evening, there was no distance left in his eyes when he spoke. "I want to turn it into a music and recovery center instead." 3 months later, the rain was gone. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of the renovated downtown building, warming the polished oak floors with soft gold light, while piano music drifted gently through the open halls. The brass plaque beside the entrance reflected the city skyline in quiet flashes beneath the spring sun. The Evelyn Langford Center for Music and Recovery. People moved differently inside this building than they did in hospitals. Slower, calmer. Veterans sat beside grand pianos with headphones resting around their necks. Elderly patients painted near the windows, while volunteers carried coffee through the halls. Nobody rushed here. Nobody pretended healing could be measured on a spreadsheet. Edward Langford stood alone, near the back corridor with both hands in the pockets of a navy overcoat, silently watching the life moving around him. The sharpness that once defined him had softened over the past few months. Not disappeared, just changed. He still carried authority naturally, but now there was something quieter beneath it. Something human. Down the hallway, Naomi Carter sat at a black Steinway piano inside the main therapy room. Sunlight rested gently against her shoulders while her fingers moved across the keys with calm familiarity. Several patients sat nearby listening in complete silence, not because they were told to, but because somehow her music made the room feel safe enough to breathe inside. Edward watched her for a long moment before stepping closer. Naomi noticed him immediately, though she finished the melody before speaking. The final notes drifted softly into the room like warm air before fading into stillness. One of the older veterans sitting nearby smiled faintly toward her before slowly leaving with his cane tapping gently against the wooden floor. Soon the room was quiet again except for distant piano notes echoing somewhere farther down the hall. Naomi looked up at Edward with the same calm expression she carried the night they first met. "You are here early," she said softly. Edward glanced toward the windows where sunlight shimmered across the glass. "Could not sleep." Naomi smiled slightly. "That usually means your mind is finally slowing down." Edward gave a quiet laugh beneath his breath because he knew she was right. He stepped closer to the piano now, his eyes moving across the therapy room around them. Framed photographs lined the walls. Veterans playing guitar. Children singing beside hospital beds. Elderly couples dancing slowly during music sessions. Life. Real life. Not polished charity gala versions of suffering. Actual people being seen. Edward rested one hand lightly against the piano. "The city council approved the second center in Brooklyn yesterday," he said quietly. Naomi blinked softly in surprise. "Already?" Edward nodded once. "Evelyn apparently inspires people to cooperate from beyond the grave." Naomi laughed gently at that, and the sound warmed the room more than the sunlight did. For a moment, neither of them spoke again. Outside, New York moved in distant waves of noise beyond the windows, but inside the center,